The morning Ethan Cole put on a $30 shirt and took the subway for the first time in 11 years, he told himself it was just an experiment, a controlled test. A few weeks undercover in his own company, long enough to find out if any woman in that building could love a man with nothing. He almost believed it. Almost. He stood on that platform surrounded by strangers, the smell of hot metal and coffee and someone else's perfume filling the air, and for the first time in a decade, nobody looked at him. Nobody moved out of his way. Nobody smiled too wide or spoke too carefully. He was just a man in a cheap shirt waiting for a train. It should have felt humiliating. Instead, it felt like oxygen. 2 years earlier, Ethan had been engaged. Her name was Vanessa, and she was the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet. She knew it too, wore it like a weapon. He had loved her the way men love things they don't fully understand, completely, recklessly, without asking enough questions. The engagement lasted 8 months. The prenuptial negotiation lasted 3. When her lawyer submitted a clause requesting a $50 million settlement in the event of divorce regardless of circumstances, Ethan sat in his attorney's office and felt something inside him go very still. He called it off the next morning. Vanessa cried. Then she called her own lawyer before the tears were dry. Before Vanessa there had been Claire, softer and quieter and somehow worse, because Claire had been patient. Claire had taken 2 years building something that felt real, learning his habits, memorizing his preferences, becoming exactly the woman he seemed to need. It wasn't until his CFO flagged an unusual wire transfer that the whole architecture came down. Claire had been funneling information to a competitor. The relationship had been a job. He had been the assignment. After Claire, Ethan stopped dating. He worked. He expanded. He turned Coal Industries from a $200 million operation into a company valued at close to $4 billion, and he did it by being ruthless about what was real and what wasn't. He became very good at reading people in boardrooms, in negotiations, in situations where money was visibly on the table. What he couldn't figure out was how to read people when the money was invisible, but still somehow the only thing anyone was looking at. The idea came to him at 3 in the morning, the way most of his worst and best ideas did. If he couldn't find out who a person really was when they knew who he was, he would find out who a person really was when they didn't. Simple, ruthless, possibly insane. He told only one person, Marcus Webb, his head of HR and the closest thing he had to a friend. And Marcus spent 20 minutes trying to talk him out of it before accepting that it was going to happen regardless. They built a cover story that could survive casual scrutiny. Ethan Thomas, Junior Administrative Coordinator, transferred from the Denver branch. Moderate resume, unremarkable references, the kind of file that HR processes without remembering. Ethan moved into an apartment in a neighborhood where nobody would recognize him, traded his car for a Metro card, and on a Monday morning in October, walked through the employee entrance of his own company as someone else entirely. The first week was strange in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had spent years at the top of that building, in offices where the air felt different, where every surface was chosen by a designer whose sole job was to communicate power quietly. The administrative floor was nothing like that. It was loud in a low-key, constant way, keyboards and phone calls and someone's lunch being reheated in a microwave down the hall. People talked over cubicle walls. They complained openly about software that didn't work. They brought in birthday cakes for colleagues whose names Ethan didn't recognize, even though those colleagues had worked for him for years. He noticed everything. He catalogued people the way he catalogued assets, their motivations, their alliances, the social architecture of who deferred to whom and why. There were 3 women who immediately positioned themselves near him, finding reasons to ask questions, to offer help, to laugh at things that weren't particularly funny. He recognized the behavior. He had been on the receiving end of it his entire adult life, and even filtered through a cheap shirt and a fabricated job title. Something about him apparently still broadcast the same frequency. And then there was Maya Rivers. He noticed her on the 3rd day, not because she was loud or striking or particularly visible, but because she was the negative space that everything else organized around. When she walked into a room, conversations didn't stop. They just subtly rerouted. When she spoke in the one team meeting he attended that week, 2 people talked over her simultaneously, and nobody commented on it, as if it was simply the natural order of things. She had the posture of someone who had learned to take up less space, and had been doing it so long she'd forgotten there was another option. She wasn't invisible exactly. It was more that she had been made to feel like she should be, and somewhere along the way she had half accepted it. But Ethan watched her work, and what he saw didn't match the treatment at all. She caught 2 errors in a budget report that everyone else had signed off on. She resolved a vendor dispute in a single phone call that a senior coordinator had been mishandling for a week. She did these things quietly, without announcement, and then went back to her desk as if she hadn't just done anything worth noticing. He found out her history in fragments. Maya had applied for a promotion to department supervisor 8 months ago. She had been passed over for a man named Derek Holt, who was louder and better dressed and significantly less competent, a fact that was now common knowledge on the floor, but seemed to have had no impact on the original decision. Before that, there had been a project she'd led that delivered results above target, results that her then-manager had presented to leadership under his own name. She hadn't quit. She hadn't made a scene. She had just kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept being exactly as capable as she was, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. Ethan told himself he found her interesting the way he found any efficient system interesting. He told himself this for about 4 days before he stopped believing it. The first real conversation they had was an accident. He was in the break room at 7 in the evening, the floor mostly empty, eating a sandwich he'd bought from the cart downstairs because he hadn't yet figured out how to cook in his new apartment, and ordering delivery felt conspicuous. She came in to get her bag from the cabinet above the microwave, looked at his sandwich, and said, without any particular warmth, that the cart on 5th was better. He said he'd try it. She said, "Don't bother with the turkey. Get the chicken." Then she left. It was the most honest interaction he'd had in months. After that, he started paying attention to the small details of who she was. Not the professional competence, which he'd already catalogued, but the person underneath it. She kept a paperback in her bag and read 3 pages at a time in whatever small gaps appeared in the day. She was funny in a dry, almost accidental way, as if the observations escaped her before she could decide whether it was appropriate to say them out loud. She had no patience for performed emotions and an almost uncanny ability to detect when someone was managing her rather than talking to her. That last quality made the situation somewhat inconvenient, given that Ethan was, technically, managing her by simply existing in the room. He started finding reasons to work near her. Nothing aggressive, nothing that could be read as pursuit. He wasn't sure yet what it was, and he needed to be sure before it was anything at all. He asked her a question about a process he already knew the answer to. She explained it without condescension, but also without the particular softness that people deployed when they wanted something from someone. She talked to him like he was a person. It sounds like a small thing. For Ethan Cole, it had been years since anyone had done it without calculation. By the 3rd week, he was eating lunch near her section. By the 4th, they had a loose, unannounced habit of talking for a few minutes in the break room at the end of the day. She told him about the promotion she hadn't gotten, not bitterly, just factually, the way someone describes weather. She said she'd almost quit, had the resignation letter half written at home on her laptop, then decided she wasn't going to let Derek's mediocrity determine the shape of her life. She said it plainly, without performance, and Ethan sat across from her in the break room light and thought, there it is. That's what real looks like. He should have told her then. He knew it even as he said nothing. He told himself he needed more time, more certainty, 1 more week of being sure. He gave himself 1 more week, and then another, and in the space of that delay, Derek Holt began to notice something he didn't like. Derek noticed that Maya was talking to the new guy. Derek had spent 8 months systematically ensuring that Maya Rivers remained exactly where she was, beneath him, beside him at best, never above, because Derek understood with the instincts of a deeply mediocre person that Maya was the only one in the building who could actually do his job better than him. He had taken her project, he had blocked her promotion, he had spent months making sure the right people thought of her as difficult, as a problem, as someone whose good work was occasional and whose complaints were frequent. And it had worked, and he needed it to keep working. The new guy was a variable Derek hadn't accounted for. He started small. A comment in a team meeting implying that the budget corrections Maya had caught were actually errors she'd introduced. A conversation with their floor manager suggesting that Maya had been resistant to the new workflow system, which was untrue but plausible enough to plant. He told 2 colleagues separately that he was concerned about her attitude, that she seemed checked out, that it was a shame because she used to be better. He did all of this quietly, with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing perceptions for years. Maya heard pieces of it secondhand. Ethan watched her absorb each piece with the controlled stillness of someone who had been here before and knew that reacting was exactly what Derek wanted. She didn't react. She worked harder, documented more carefully, arrived earlier. And Ethan watched her compensate for a campaign she hadn't started, in a war she hadn't declared, and felt something in him sharpen into something close to fury. In the 5th week, Derek escalated. A significant client report was due. The kind that got reviewed at the senior level, the kind that left a mark on whoever was credited. Maya had done 70% of the analytical work. Derek spent 3 days restructuring her contributions into the document in ways that redistributed the authorship, burying her most critical findings in appendices and moving his own minor additions to the executive summary. He submitted it under a shared byline, weighted toward himself, and presented it in the department meeting as primarily his framework with team support. Ethan sat 3 seats away and watched it happen in real time. He watched Maya's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He watched her look at the document summary on the screen, recognize the architecture of what had been done, and then look down at her notebook and write something he couldn't read. She didn't speak. She didn't correct the record. She had learned at great cost that correcting the record openly only ever became a story about her behavior, not Derek's. That evening, after everyone else had left, Ethan found her at her desk still working. He sat down across from her and he said, "I saw what he did." She looked up. She said, "It doesn't matter." He said, "It does matter." She said, "Maybe, but I can't prove intent, and if I raise it, I become the person who can't work in a team, and Derek becomes the person who's dealing with a difficult colleague, and nothing changes except that now I'm also labeled a problem. So it doesn't matter. Not in any way that helps me." Ethan said nothing. He sat with what she'd said, with the precision and resignation of it, with the fact that she had mapped the entire trap so clearly and still had no exit. He said, "What if someone else raised it?" She looked at him carefully. She said, "Don't. I mean it. This is my situation, and I handle it my way." He said, "Okay." He said okay, and he meant it, and he went home and he sat in his apartment and spent 3 hours thinking about what she'd said, and then he called Marcus. He told Marcus to pull every document Maya had originated or significantly contributed to in the past 18 months. He told Marcus to cross-reference authorship credits, presentation credits, and performance review language. He told Marcus to do it quietly. Marcus was quiet for a moment on the other end of the phone, and then he said, "How bad is it going to be?" Ethan said, "I already know how bad it is. I need the paperwork to match what I know." The paperwork was worse than what he knew. 4 projects, 3 instances of redirected credit, 1 performance review that used language almost certainly seeded by Derek. The word resistant appeared twice, difficult once, language that had no basis in any observable record but had clearly influenced the promotion decision. A formal complaint Maya had submitted 14 months ago about a misattributed project. Marked received, never actioned, buried in a subfolder of a subfolder where things went to disappear. Marcus asked what they were going to do. Ethan said, "Fix it." All of it. But not yet. There was still something he had to do first. In the 6th week, she was assigned a report that should have been split between 2 people and had been given to her alone because the other person was Derek, and Derek had a dinner. Ethan stayed. He didn't make a production of it. He just stayed and helped with the parts he could help with, which was most of it, and they finished 2 hours later and walked out into the cold air, and she looked at him and said simply, "Thank you," and he said it was nothing, and she said it wasn't nothing, that she knew the difference, and that she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He nearly told her then, stood on that sidewalk and felt the lie sitting in his chest like something with weight and almost put it down. But she was looking at him, with those clear, careful eyes, and something in her expression was open in a way it almost never was. And he understood that if he told her now, in this moment, the openness would close and might not open again. He needed a better answer than the truth delivered without context. He needed to earn the right to tell her. He gave himself 2 more weeks. He used them to fall completely in love with her. It happened the way real things happen. Not in a single moment, but in accumulation. In the specific gravity of small details that only matter because of everything surrounding them. The way she defended a junior colleague in a meeting without making it a speech. The way she laughed, full and unguarded, at something he said one afternoon, and then looked briefly surprised at herself as if she'd forgotten she could. The way she talked about her mother, who was sick, quietly and without self-pity. The logistics of care folded into her life with the same competence she brought to everything. The way she was so entirely herself, with no performance, no management, no audience calibration. He had never met anyone like her. He had been surrounded by extraordinary people his entire professional life, and he had never met anyone like her. In the 8th week, Marcus called. The board had scheduled a public announcement, a major acquisition, Ethan's first appearance at a press event in months. His face was going to be everywhere. It was over. He had 4 days. He spent 2 of them constructing and discarding approaches, looking for the version that minimized damage and maximized the probability of a good outcome. On the 3rd day, he accepted there wasn't one. There was only the truth, delivered before she heard it from someone else, delivered with nothing held back, delivered by a man who was not going to ask for forgiveness before he'd given her everything she needed to make that decision freely. But first, Derek. On the morning of the 4th day, Ethan walked into the building as himself, his real name on the badge, his real face. He rode the elevator to the administrative floor for the first time from the executive entrance, and he walked to the floor manager's office, and he asked for a full-floor meeting in the main conference room at 10 o'clock. The floor manager's face went through 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. He said yes immediately. At 10 o'clock, the entire administrative department sat around the conference table, and Ethan stood at the head of it. And the room was the particular quality of silent that happens when people are trying very hard not to show how surprised they are. Maya sat near the middle of the table. She looked at him, and her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very still, the way it goes still when a person is rapidly revising everything they thought they knew. Ethan said, "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm the CEO of this company. Most of you didn't know I was here these past 8 weeks, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, there's something this team needs to know." He laid it out without drama and without cruelty, because neither was necessary. The facts were sufficient on their own. 4 projects, 3 instances of misattributed work, 1 buried complaint, a promotion decision contaminated by a performance review that used language with no basis in any documented behavior. He said that as of this morning, Derek Holt was on administrative leave pending a full HR review, that the promotion decision was being formally reconsidered, and that every project credit misattribution was being corrected in the permanent record effective immediately. He said, "The person whose work built the foundation of this department's last 18 months of results is sitting in this room, and this company failed her, and I failed her by not knowing it sooner, and that ends today." He didn't say Maya's name. He didn't need to. Every person in the room knew exactly who he meant, and every person in the room turned and looked at her, and for once, the looking was not the kind that made a person want to disappear. Maya looked at the table. Her jaw was tight. She was holding herself very still, with the particular discipline of someone who is not going to cry in a conference room, regardless of what it costs her. She didn't look at him. He didn't expect her to. He had just turned her private wound into a public event, even in service of justice, and she hadn't asked him to, and he knew it, and he was going to have to answer for it. The meeting ended. Derek's desk was already being cleared by the time people filed out. Ethan waited until the room was empty, except for the 2 of them, and then he sat down across from her, the length of the conference table between them, and he said, "I know you told me not to." She said, "You did it anyway." He said, "Yes." She said, "That wasn't your decision to make." He said, "You're right. It wasn't. And I made it, and I'd make it again. And I understand if that's not something you can accept." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Who are you?" And he told her. All of it. The real name she already knew now, the company, Vanessa and Claire, and the years of not being able to trust what was real. The morning he'd put on the $30 shirt and taken the subway, the break room, the chicken sandwich, the library, the report they'd finished together in the empty office. the sidewalk in October when he'd almost said it. All of it laid out in order without softening. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, and the conference room was very still, and outside the window the city moved at its indifferent pace. She said, "So the whole time you were watching me, you knew what Derek was doing to me?" He said, "I found out in the 5th week. I should have acted sooner. I told myself I was waiting until I had the full picture. That was partly true and partly an excuse, and I won't pretend otherwise." She said, "And you thought you could manage this, fix it your way, on your timeline, and then tell me afterward?" He said, "Yes. And I was wrong." She said, "I spent 8 weeks talking to you like you were a person I was getting to know." He said, "I know." She said, "And you were running an experiment." He said, "In the beginning. It stopped being an experiment. I need you to know that, not because it excuses anything, but because it's true. And I told you I wasn't going to give you anything that wasn't true." She stood up. She said, "I need to go home." He said, "Okay." She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she said, "The thing you did today, the meeting, the record, that was right. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't right because I'm angry at how you did it." She paused. She said, "But I'm angry at how you did it." He said, "I know." She left. He sat in the empty conference room for a long time, at the head of a table he technically owned, in a building he technically owned, in a company that existed because of 11 years of his choices and his work and his relentless forward motion. And he felt the specific helplessness of a man who has run out of moves. There was nothing left to engineer, nothing to structure or leverage or optimize. There was only the weight, and whatever she decided, and his obligation to accept it. She didn't come in the next day. He sat in his real office on the executive floor, behind the desk and the view and the correct name on the door, and dealt with the fallout from the announcement and the Derek situation and the acquisition press cycle, and did all of it competently and on autopilot, while the part of him that mattered waited for a knock on a door 30 floors below. She came back on Monday. She walked past his old desk. Someone else was sitting there now, and sat at hers and started working. At lunch, she didn't go to the break room. In the afternoon, on her way to the printer, she passed a junior colleague who was struggling with a vendor call, and she stopped, and she handled it in 4 minutes, and then she kept walking. She was still herself. He had upended her entire professional reality, and she had come back in on Monday and was still entirely herself. He didn't deserve that. He knew he didn't deserve it. He also knew that watching it was the closest thing to hope he had. On Wednesday, she sent him an email. It was 3 lines, professional, about a discrepancy she'd found in the Q3 projections. He replied within 4 minutes. The discrepancy was real, she was right, and he forwarded it to the finance team with her name on it. 10 minutes later, she walked past the glass wall of his office on her way back from the kitchen, and she didn't look in, but she slowed down by maybe half a step, and then she kept walking. It was not forgiveness. He understood that. It was something smaller and more honest than forgiveness, an acknowledgement that she hadn't decided yet, and that she wasn't going to make the decision under pressure or on his timeline. He had spent his entire adult life moving at the speed of his own ambition. He slowed down. He waited. He let her set the pace of something for the first time because she had earned that right in a way no contract could formalize. 3 weeks later, she knocked on his office door. He said, "Come in." She came in and stood in front of his desk and said, "The Q4 projections have a structural problem in the international segment." He looked at the file she set in front of him. She was right. He said, "How long did this take you to find?" She said, "About 20 minutes. He said, "It took our external analysts 3 weeks and they didn't find it." She said, "They were looking at the wrong variable." He looked up at her. He said, "Would you have dinner with me?" She said, "That depends." He said, "On what?" She said, "On whether you understand the difference between making a decision for someone because you think you know best and making a decision with someone because you actually respect them." He said, "I didn't understand it before. I understand it now." She said, "How do I know that?" He said, "You don't. I know that's not the answer you want, but it's the only honest one. You'd have to find out the same way you find out anything real, slowly, over time, with enough room to leave if you're wrong." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a better answer than I expected." He said, I've had time to practice. Something moved in her face. Not a smile exactly, but the edge of one, the place where a smile lives before it decides to happen. She said, "One dinner." "And you're paying," he said, obviously. She said, "And if you ever make a decision about my life without asking me first, I will walk out and I will not come back." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean it." He said, "I know you mean it. That's why I believe you." She picked up her file from his desk. She looked at him once more, with those clear and careful eyes that had never once told him anything other than the truth, and she said, "Thursday, 7 o'clock," then she left. He sat alone in the office with the view of the city he had built a company in, and the acquisition was pending, and the board was waiting, and the press cycle was still running, and none of it was the thing that he was thinking about. He was thinking about a break room and a $30 shirt, and a woman who had told a stranger to get the chicken, and who had then proceeded to be the most honest thing in his life for 8 weeks without knowing she was doing it, and who had just walked out of his office after extracting a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Thursday, 7 o'clock. For the first time in 11 years, Ethan Cole had something to look forward to that no amount of money could have bought him.